Yo, what's going on everyone? It's Brian with DrinkABeerandPlayAGame, and today I am going to be reviewing A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES. Now of course, this game has a lot of controversy because it was published by LJN. Does it deserve all the hate it gets? Let's find out. Released in October of 1989 in Europe, this game would get its USA release 1 year later. It was actually developed by Rare and published by LJN, which of course you guys already know. The general plot of the game is that a group of 4 teenagers are attempting to find all the bones of Freddy Krueger in order to fight him and finally put him to rest for good. The game was not made as a direct adaptation of any one Nightmare on Elm Street film. Although it heavily borrows from Dream Warriors, you can also see little pieces here and there from the second film and the fourth film. But let's jump right into the presentation of the game. And as I mentioned, this game was developed by Rare. This is the same studio that brought us countless N64 classics, and honestly, I did not realize that when I was playing through this game for the first time. It's funny enough, when you hear the music, a lot of people who were watching me stream this game, one of their first comments was, "Who did the music for this? This sounds like Rare." And I gotta be honest, the music itself is one of the better highlights of the game. The music for the different levels are all way more catchy than they should be. The sound design itself outside of the music is not as good of a highlight. It's very basic. Almost all the hit sounds are kind of identical, and there's no enemy noises or noises outside of just the hit sounds. Now the graphics themselves, there's a weird color scheme going on here, because when you're outside, when you're in the cemetery, and when you're in some of the locations, it doesn't look too bad. But I have this one issue where all the enemies are in this weird black and white grayscale. I don't know if this was a specific design choice because they really wanted to make the enemies stand out, but it doesn't make sense to me. And when you're in the dream world, some of the enemies might turn red, but really they're only usually 1 to 2 tones, and it's very bland looking. Just like the main characters themselves. As I said, this was not a direct adaptation of any specific movie, so you don't really know who you're playing as, other than a generic guy who's dressed in all red and has sleeveless shirts, or a girl in all red. Outside of that, there's nothing really special about the characters themselves. Freddy in his various forms look better than most of the enemies, but that's not saying much. And his full main body sprite, I wish there was just a little bit more detail. So while the sound is a high point, the graphics at best are very just mid-tier for a game like this. The control I can cover real fast. You have a jump button, an attack button, and you move left and right. That's about it. When you do find power-ups, you have the ability to select through different ones by hitting the select button, and outside of that, there's not really much to it. One interesting fact is that this game had the ability to be up to 4 players if you have an NES 4 score. Which, of course, I don't know about you guys, no one I knew growing up had that. So, yeah, if you're somebody who has this game, has a 4 score, and you can trick your friends into playing it, maybe you'll have a good time. So now let's dive into the actual gameplay. I already mentioned the main goal of the game is to collect all of Freddy's bones so that you can face his final form and defeat him for good. Kind of like Castlevania 2. And this game pulls from a lot of various games. The whole game takes place on Elm Street, and you have 7 main levels you have to go through. There's 3 houses, a high school, a junkyard, the cemetery, and of course, Freddy's house. Now when you first start, you have to enter one of the 3 houses. But what's interesting is each game it can be a completely different house, so you never know which one to go to first. Through some trial and error, once you go through, you're going to realize this game is just a simple collect-a-thon, which is basically what Rare is known for. The bones are always easily visible, and some of the jumps are a little bit more difficult to get to, but you're going to be jumping and battling through many different enemies. all of which are basically some form of an animal. You have bats, spiders, flies, rats, snakes, and then you have this weird zombie or Frankenstein monsters thing. I really don't know what it is. But as I said earlier, just like Castlevania 2, you have this little sleep meter that if it depletes, you enter the dream world, and all these previous enemies turn into a much tougher version of their previous form. So you have the rats that turn into random devil guys. You have spiders, which are Freddy head spiders, and so on and so forth. To avoid falling asleep, you have to keep moving. If you're lucky enough, you can find some coffee. But ultimately, I never found myself unable to avoid going to sleep. When you do fall asleep, if you find a boombox, you can wake yourself up. The only advantage of going into this dream world is you can use one of 3 power-ups you can find throughout the game. And this is where it pulls from Dream Warrior, because you can essentially become an acrobat who has the ability to jump really high and throw javelins. You can become a necromancer, which has a really long ranged attack, and he can kind of float jump. And then, of course, you can become the ninja, which is by far the best thing, because he has a crazy good jump kick and a throwing star ability. The only reason you don't want to stay in the dream world too long, though, is eventually you're going to start hearing that classic Nightmare on Elm Street theme, which means you will have to face off against Freddy. I already said this game pulls from other games. That reminded me immediately of Jaws, which we've already reviewed. There's just something about having to fight that main boss and you know it doesn't add anything to your game, which is a real driver for you to avoid getting to that point. Now, there's really nothing else special about the levels themselves. They have some booby traps, some weird spots like in the cemetery where you have to jump on bubbles that burst, which I always hate those in video games. But the bosses felt really lazy in this game. The first boss you go against is a Freddy glove on a bunch of balls. It looks like a chain almost. So you think, okay, that's kind of interesting. But then the very next one is just Freddy's head on those same balls. Yeah, okay, that's weird once again. And then this is where the laziness comes in, because the next boss is just that same hand you fought before, but now it's floating. It's not attached to anything. And it goes on like this. You end up fighting Freddy's head again, and then a ghost version of Freddy's head. And then they all have the same basic generic pattern with a few little added abilities. They get really boring and they can be really annoying the first couple times you fight them, but once you get the pattern down, it's just like, okay, let's get through this boss fight. And this game does one of those things that I really dislike, which is the final bosses, when you get to Freddy's house and you're about to fight his final form, are just every boss you've already fought, one after another. It's a gauntlet. I don't like it because by that point, once again, you already know the patterns. It's not that it's really tough, but if you've been playing through this game, and God bless you if you played through and didn't use a save state, you will just be exhausted and you might make some little mistakes and have to go back. The final form of Freddy is just like when you fight him randomly throughout the game, which is a little disappointing. There's nothing really that difficult about him. And once he's defeated, you throw all the bones in a boiler, and game over. And to be honest, this was an interesting take on this game, because how else can you do a Freddy game? They managed to squeeze in there the Dream Warrior stuff with the different powers, a sleep meter, so I kind of appreciate what they were going for. What really pisses me off, and I have a screenshot here, is this game was originally going to be meant for you to play as Freddy. You go around and you terrorize the kids. Anyone who watches Nightmare on Elm Street, you might kind of root for Nancy, but really, Freddy's a star, and we all would have loved to play as him. I think because of the whole controversy with the Atari game, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they probably thought it wasn't the best idea to have a maniac on the loose killing and torturing a bunch of poor teenagers. So they ultimately went with this version instead. I would recommend this if you are a hardcore horror fan, and like I said, you may really enjoy the tunes. Definitely don't pay too much for it. Overall, when I round up all my scores, I gave this game a 5.8. I liked some of the things they tried to do, but the annoying control, the boring bosses, and the grindy nature of just trying to memorize every pattern, it can wear on you really fast. And if you'd like to see a complete breakdown of all my scores, please head over to our site, DrinkABeerandPlayAGame, to see the full review written up there. When it comes to beer pairing, I went with a super obvious choice, and that's the Conshohocken Brewing Company's Nightmare on East Elm Street. This is their pumpkin beer that's only 5.8%, which is really low. It has a ton of flavor. The can looks amazing, and I'll tell you what, with a game like this, you're going to need something to enjoy, so you might as well be your beer. But remember to drink your beers and play your games responsibly.